When it comes to figuring out who killed who in Scream 6, one of the most helpful tools we'll be able to use is Kirby Reed's picture board, as it contains detailed information pertaining to the deaths of several of Ghostface's victims. In particular, it tells us that Dr. Stone's body was discovered at 8:37 a.m. on October the 30th, which is the same morning that Sam and Tara were being interrogated by Detective Wayne Bailey. However, we can also infer from that same scene that Bailey was still present at the precinct as late as 8:10 a.m., meaning that he unlikely had the time to commit the murder and instead had either Ethan or Quinn do the job in his place. Stick around till the end of the video to find out exactly how the killers went about planning their villainous scheme, as well as get a detailed analysis of who committed which Ghostface act. What is up, Scream team? Zach Cherry here, and if you're new to the channel and interested in deep dives into the Scream franchise and its various Ghostface killers, go ahead and hit that subscribe button with those notification alerts turned on. That way you can stay up to date on all my content, including the other episodes in this series where we went over who killed who in the previous 5 Scream movies. As far as figuring out who did what in Scream 6, there are 16 instances of either phone calls, kills, or attacks, which all need to be attributed individually amongst 3 different Ghostface killers, as well as the 2 other Ghostfaces who were working independently of them. There's Laura's phone call and text messages, Laura's kill, Jason's phone call, Greg's kill, Jason's kill, Sam's phone call after leaving the apartment, the ensuing attack that leads into the kills at the bodega, Dr. Stone's kill, the apartment attack that includes Paul 2.0 and Annika's kills, Sam's phone call in the park, the first phone call to Gale, the attack in her apartment that includes the Brooks kill, the second phone call to Gale, Mindy's attack on the subway, and then the first Ghostface that shows up at the theater, along with the second Ghostface that shows up at the theater. Before we get to that though, I want to thank Rookie Mage Games for sponsoring this video with Don't Get Stabbed, the wildly entertaining party card game where you get to kill your family and friends, but just for pretend. If you're a big fan of Scream and always trying to figure out who killed who, then you'll love the interactive experience of playing as slasher movie victims, strategically using a series of action and combo cards in order to survive and escape. On the other hand, however, you might prefer to secretly play as the killer, trying to take out all of the other players by sabotaging their efforts to stay alive. With plenty of hilarious horror tropes behind every card, you'll feel right at home in your own personal slasher movie, just in time for Halloween. Don't Get Stabbed is available on Amazon or directly from their official website, which are both linked down below, and if you order your set now until November 1st, you can use the promo code ZachCherry to get 10% off of your purchase. Now, without any further ado, let's go figure out who killed who in Scream 6. As mentioned previously, we have 5 different Ghostface killers and 16 different events. However, for the sake of streamlining this process, we can rule out that Greg Bruckner had nothing to do with any of the calls or murders, as Jason more or less intimates that he acted alone, and did so without the consent or knowledge of his partner. Further to that, it's unknown if Greg was even alive at any point during these events, as his murder possibly took place prior to the movie's real time. That means that Jason Carvey acted alone in calling Laura and setting up the fake blind date in order to lure her into a trap. We know as much is true since for the bulk of the phone call, Jason's own voice can be heard on the other end of the line, and since he also unmasks himself immediately after killing Laura, this can all be taken at face value to indicate that he is solely responsible for her murder. There are of course other things that we know for certain based on process of elimination or character confessions that occur later on, but let's hold off on those for now because I want to build a linear timeline of the Kirsch family scheme in order to make the most sense of how they went about carrying it all out. However, when it comes to my Who Killed Who episodes, I like to dive a little bit deeper. So rather than just supposition who I believe was responsible for what, I actually turn the movie inside out and imagine the events as they would play from the perspective of the killers. The reason for this is that I find it builds a more interesting narrative that adds nuance to the murder plot and allows me to examine the evidence based on a balance of probabilities when there isn't necessarily a clear-cut indication of who was responsible for what crime. A lot of you might think that that's ridiculous, but I do take this analysis very seriously, almost as though I were treating it like a courtroom trial. Because at the end of the day, there needs to be a fair verdict that is based on logic and practicality, rather than just one's own personal whims and preferences. So with that said, let's start off with everything that we do know about the Kirsch family. First of all, even though I will be referring to each one of the family members by their credited and or scripted names, Wayne Bailey, Quinn Bailey, and Ethan Landry, it makes the most sense to presume that each one of these identities is a fake, a la Debbie Salt actually being Nancy Loomis in Scream 2. We know for certain that Ethan Landry Landry is a made-up name, as he admits so himself, but it should be gleaned that this is also the case for Wayne and Quinn, meaning that we as an audience don't ever learn what any of their actual first names are. This just seems the most plausible, given that Wayne Bailey, as a police detective, was able to conceal his relationship to Richie Kirsch from any sort of government records, and in terms of Quinn faking her death, it would be much easier for her to do so under a false identity, as it has to be understood that the killers would eventually return to their regular lives, which Quinn wouldn't be able to do if she had legally been declared as a dead person. Therefore, I accept that the family's true name is Kirsch, as indicated by Richie's writer-director credit at the end of his fan film, so hopefully at some point in future sequels, we'll officially find out what each of the killers' real names are. Now, for the sake of being as thorough as possible, and only where applicable, I'm going to run through every Ghostface event through the lens of each of the 3 different killers. That way, we can examine every possible scenario and settle on the one that makes the most logical sense. So when it comes to Jason's phone call and kill, the first question we need to ask ourselves is whether this is all being done by the same person, or if there were multiple killers in the apartment at the same time. Based on the action of the scene, it would appear that whoever is talking to Jason on the phone is clearly observing him walking through the apartment, as they're giving him directional clues on how to find Greg's body. We also know that this particular call is being made from Greg's phone, as evidenced by Jason verifying the caller ID, which makes this the only other phone the Kirsch family uses to call their targets, as we can deduce that every call subsequent to this is made from Richie's old phone number that is still saved in Sam's contacts. Now, it could of course be possible that Jason's caller is using Greg's phone from a remote location, as they would still have the capability to access the video surveillance in the apartment. But just because of the way the scene is structured, it appears that the Ghostface who kills Jason is hiding in one of the bedrooms, which seems to imply that they had to have known the right moment in order to come out and sneak up behind him, meaning that the call was probably not placed remotely, and that Jason's caller and killer are one and the same person. In terms of Greg's kill, we aren't given a clear indication of how long he had been dead before Jason came home, so it's kind of impossible to prove whether one or both of the other Ghostfaces might have been there earlier in the night to assist with the dismemberment. Judging by the state of Greg's body, this would have been a very messy kill, yet there are no signs of a disturbance or any blood to be found anywhere in the apartment. This tells us that Greg was either killed off-site, where his body was then brought back so it could be staged for Jason to find, or that the killer/killers had also waited for Greg to come home, but had meticulously covered the apartment in plastic beforehand, which would explain why there are no visual signs of the crime having ever taken place. Either way, there's no evidence to confirm or negate the presence of multiple Ghostfaces on site during this scene, and since it's never implied or explicitly stated otherwise, we can probably take this at face value to mean that whichever Ghostface it was that killed Jason was probably the same one that killed Greg. Technicalities aside, we still need to figure out which of the 3 killers this is. But in order to do that, we'll first need to get a better sense of each one of their known whereabouts by building a timeline of the events for that night. Based on the information shown to us on Kirby's picture board, we can see a time of 9:27 p.m. beside the photos of Jason and Greg. Since there were no witnesses to either of their murders, this is likely not an exact time of death, but rather the time the police arrived on the scene, or potentially when a neighbor discovered their bodies. In the case of Laura, the picture board doesn't really give us many details in regards to her murder, but based on the time on her phone showing it to be 7:10 p.m., and with the understanding that her scene is playing out in real time, that lets us know that we can clock her time of death to have occurred at approximately 7:15. Based on this information, it lets us know that Jason's time of death could have occurred at any point in this 2-hour and 12-minute window. However, we can probably narrow that down even further by taking into account these New York City locations and their proximity from one another, as distance and travel times will definitely play a factor in how we analyze some of this evidence. So even though the time between Jason's killing of Laura and his arrival at home is presented on screen in a relatively short span, there is a noticeable time cut right before he bumps into Tara around the Blackmore University campus. Add to this the fact that most of the primary locations in the movie are situated around 6th Avenue and West 45th Street. This can all be gleaned from timestamps and location addresses we see on police evidence, which I'll explain more in just a minute, but as we're told through dialogue during Jason's conversation with Laura in the film's opening, the restaurant Hasta El Fuego is actually located on Hudson Street. When we take a look at a map of New York City, we can see that Hudson is a north-south north-south oriented road that runs from Tribeca through Greenwich Village, all the way to the meatpacking district on the west side of Manhattan, while all of the other locations are concentrated to one specific area in the Midtown Theater District. That would mean that since Jason went to a different part of the city to kill Laura, and then made the trip home on foot as we can presume, the time it would have taken him to walk from Hudson all the way back to his apartment, according to Google Maps, could have taken anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes, providing he didn't make any stops or detours along the way. As Jason started walking home at 7:15 p.m. and was killed within minutes of arriving there, that would narrow down the time of his death to have occurred anywhere between 8 and 8:30 p.m., meaning that at least another hour of time had elapsed before his and Greg's bodies were eventually discovered. This also tells us that the events that immediately followed the title card are taking place no earlier than 9:27, as the scene starts off with Sam noticing the police sirens as they pull up to Jason and Greg's apartment, which, as we later see, is just down the block from Dr. Stone's office. As we don't get an indication of the time after this until Gale's unanswered phone call to Sam at 9:57 p.m., it lets us know that everything going on in between these scenes is all happening in the span of exactly 30 minutes. As Sam herself has time to leave Dr. Stone's office, walk past Jason and Greg's apartment, come home to find out from Quinn that Tara went out partying, go to the OKB house to tase Frankie in the balls, and then fight with her sister as they walk through the Blackmore University quad before finally coming home to see the news report on TV, we should be able to extrapolate that these locations are all within the proximity of a few city blocks, which is later confirmed by the various addresses seen on the bagged evidence of old Ghostface masks. Now, based on this timeline, we're properly introduced to both Quinn and Ethan at approximately 9:40 p.m., with Wayne then making his first appearance on screen at 9:57, coinciding with Gale's unanswered call to Sam. We know that Quinn has been at home with her boyfriend and that Ethan is at the OKB party with Chad. However, there's really no way to determine how long they've been at their respective locations, as Quinn could have just gotten home shortly before Sam did, and Ethan may have joined the rest of the friends after they had already arrived at the party, which would still realistically give both of them plenty of time to have been at Jason and Greg's apartment at any point earlier in the night. When it comes to Wayne, things are a little bit murkier, as we're quite literally introduced to him while he's surveying the crime scene, which again doesn't account for his whereabouts prior to this, as by that point, Jason had already been dead for at least an hour and a half. However, during Wayne's interrogation of Sam and Tara, he mentions that he wasn't originally assigned to the case, but was instead offered it when the first on-scene detective realized the connection to Quinn due to Sam's driver's license being left at the scene. Of course, Wayne could be lying about that detail, which would be a risky move on his part, but if this is true, it creates an even larger window of time where he's unaccounted for, without having a possible alibi in any of the film's other characters. As far as Sam's driver's license is concerned, though, I think it's pretty safe to assume that this was stolen by Quinn, as she would have the easiest access to it, being roommates and all. But again, this doesn't guarantee that she planted it herself at the crime scene, as she could have just as easily passed it off to Wayne or Ethan. Because of that, we don't really have anything concrete just yet to pinpoint who this Ghostface killer is, but it's still helpful to establish a timeline, as we'll have a much better understanding of things as we move through these subsequent Ghostface events in chronological order. So when it comes to the question of which Ghostface killer placed the call to Sam as she and Tara were heading to the precinct, there's actually a subtle exchange of dialogue that occurs a few scenes earlier that I believe clues us in on this answer. When Quinn enters Tara's room to talk to her, she puts her phone down on Tara's desk before taking a seat. When Chad comes into the room a minute later, Quinn gets up to exit but leaves her phone behind. Now, it's very possible that Quinn did that intentionally as a way to mess with Tara and Chad, as she would have used that as an excuse to barge into the room without warning, but I like to think that the reason she forgot it was because she also had Richie's phone on her and momentarily forgot that she was carrying a second phone. We know that this phone with the lavender case is her primary one, as that's what she hands to Sam when she gets Wayne on the line, so it's always read to me like this was a way to hint at Quinn being the one who places the subsequent phone call, as we also know by process of elimination that she's the Ghostface who uses Richie's phone to call Sam in the park, since Wayne and Ethan are both accounted for in that same scene. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Quinn is also the Ghostface who attacks Sam and Tara, leading to the kills in the bodega, as we should know by now that one of the killers will sometimes place the phone call, while the other one will position themselves nearby in order to jump out when they're given a specific cue. Taking the scene at face value, however, the implied scenario here would see just one killer following Sam and Tara, where they would then act as both the caller and attacker, as they mention over the phone that the sisters should watch their backs almost simultaneously with Ghostface jumping out at them.
You and Tara better watch your backs.
You better watch yours.
Having said that, this then also begs the question as to how could neither Sam or Tara hear the killer speaking on the phone mere feet away from them, as it appears that Ghostface is hiding somewhere in the immediate vicinity of the entrance to this building. While I do believe that it was Radio Silence's intention to frame this caller and attacker as the same person, I can't ignore the technical inconsistencies, especially since this same issue will reappear later on. And since the caller here isn't whispering to Sam like the way Charlie had to do while he was hiding in Olivia's closet in Scream 4, the most logical way this scenario can play out is if Quinn makes the phone call from the apartment, but had first called one of the other killers before then conferencing Sam into their phone call, which would allow the on-site Ghostface to listen to the conversation on mute before attacking the sisters at the opportune time. So if we are going by the theory that Quinn is the caller, which I believe is the case regardless of whether the writers had hinted at it or not, we can definitely rule her out. But it should also be obvious that this Ghostface couldn't be Quinn anyway, since she's still in the apartment when Sam and Tara leave just a few minutes earlier. Again, going by timestamps, the bodega attack occurs at 10:03 p.m., which is just 6 minutes after the unanswered phone call from Gale. That means that Sam and Tara immediately left the apartment and started walking to the precinct. Since we didn't see any of the other friends leave the apartment with them, this implies that they're all still upstairs, and since Quinn actually lives there, she would be the only one who doesn't have an immediate reason to go anywhere. This same principle can be applied to Ethan, as not only is he last seen upstairs with the rest of the friends, but it was also previously established that he and Chad are roommates. It could be presumed that the only reason he's even at the apartment is because he went to the OKB party with Chad, where the two then planned on going back to their dorm room together, but if Ethan were to leave Sam and Tara's apartment alone, it would definitely look suspicious, as the friends might retrospectively link his sudden departure to the timing of the bodega attack, which they end up doing anyway in regards to the attack on the apartment the following night. Therefore, that only leaves Wayne as the likely suspect, which is also a bit of a stretch, since just 6 minutes prior to the attack, we could see that he was at the crime scene at Jason and Greg's apartment. However, as it's previously been established, all of these locations are more or less within walking distance of each other, meaning that even though it seems extremely improbable for Wayne to hightail it out of an active crime scene and Superman himself into the Ghostface costume, it's not impossible, and out of the 3 killers, he's the only one that doesn't currently require an alibi. As the attack on the bodega only lasts a few minutes, Wayne could have easily been able to step away from the apartment crime scene, catch up to Sam and Tara, chase them into the store where he kills 3 civilians, and then disappear out the back door before his fellow police officers arrive, where he could then quietly return to his post without anyone even noticing he was ever gone. On top of all of that, it does seem to be very unanimous amongst the Scream fandom that the bodega Ghostface is Wayne, simply for the fact that this killer appears to be very tactical with the way they handle the shotgun and their knife, attributing that to the skills he would have learned on the police force. And while I don't dispute that it seems much more likely that Wayne would be more capable of this than either Ethan or Quinn, it still brings up a glaring plot hole that doesn't necessarily affect how we view the evidence, but it does raise a very important question, and that's whether or not Wayne actually is a real police detective. Personally, I like the idea that he isn't a real cop, but actually a career criminal, or maybe even ex-military with combat training, as it seems more feasible and interesting for him to have fabricated an entire career in order to create the perfect cover for an elaborate murder scheme. Otherwise, it doesn't make any logical sense for a police detective to transfer to a new job in a new city and get away with faking his name and past credentials credentials unless he was never actually a cop to begin with. This doesn't necessarily affect the immediacy of figuring out who killed who, but it does present a lot of questions that are not being answered satisfactorily and makes it very difficult to get a sense of who these killers really are. So nobody is obligated to agree with this, but my personal headcanon moving forward is that Wayne was always a bad person with a criminal history and brought his kids up in this unscrupulous environment where they were then corrupted themselves, which definitely explains why Richie had gone on to become a killer back in Scream 5. This also could be subtly hinted at in the way that both Richie and Quinn handled their knives in a similar fashion, but on top of that, part of this movie's shooting script was even going to include the revelation that Wayne had Ethan kill his wife because she didn't want to be involved in the plan, and even though this is not considered canon, it does give credence to the family's extremely disturbing nature. Moving ahead though, we get our next Ghostface kill the following morning when Dr. Stone is stabbed in the nose through his front door. As this is one of the few isolated kills in the movie where no other characters are present during the scene, it makes it a little trickier to rule out any of our Ghostfaces, so we'll once again have to build a timeline of the events in order to extrapolate the evidence. This is where Kirby's picture board comes in handy though, as Dr. Stone's crime scene photo indicates a timestamp of 8:37 a.m. However, similarly to Jason, there were also no witnesses to the murder, so we can presume that this marker reflects the time that his body was discovered. To get a more accurate window of when the murder occurred though, we can go back a few scenes before this, as during Kirby's reintroduction at the precinct, we can faintly make out a wall clock in the background that, although kind of blurry, indicates that the current time is 8:10 a.m. We do see this same clock again later when Kirby is eating lunch, now displaying that the time is 1:38 p.m., so this definitely indicates that the filmmakers were paying close attention to continuity details, meaning that we can easily count this clock as timeline canon. Adjusting for the few extra minutes that pass in the scene where the sisters are confronted by Gale, and assuming that the movie is still being presented to us chronologically, this tells us that Dr. Stone's death occurred approximately between 8:15 and 8:35 a.m., giving us a span of about 20 minutes after Sam and Tara leave the precinct. Another thing we need to decide here is whether this was one killer acting alone or if there were multiple killers hiding in the scene at the same time. Similarly to the Jason kill, we only ever see the one Ghostface, so we can probably take that at face value to mean that neither of the other two are there to assist them. However, I was given pause during this scene because there appears to be a specific sound cue that causes Dr. Stone to become distracted from the Ghostface who is knocking at the door. This initially led me to believe that there were at least two killers here, with one of them having broken in through the back of the house, but if you listen to the ambient noises very carefully, the sound which Dr. Stone is momentarily thrown off by is actually his washing machine changing its cycling mode. With that said, as there's no phone call or anything else going on here to suggest the involvement of a second or third killer, I think it's safe to assume that the Ghostface who kills Dr. Stone and steals Sam's patient file did so entirely by themselves. With all of that information in mind, let's take a look at the known whereabouts of each of our killers, but let's start with Wayne this time, as he's the only one of the three we have an exact location on. We know from the clock on the wall that Wayne can be placed at the precinct as late as 8:10. What's unclear to us, however, is where the precinct is located in relation to Dr. Stone's office. We already know that Sam and Tara's apartment is close to her therapist, and that the precinct was presumably close enough for Sam and Tara to walk to the night before, but as we can see from the scene where they leave the precinct, they instead choose to take a cab. Of course, this is assuming that they are going home, but it still stands to reason that they might have opted to be driven there, as they were most likely fatigued from staying awake all night, and were also probably trying to avoid the mob of reporters. Either way, that gives Wayne just over 20 minutes to travel this hypothetical distance in order to get to Dr. Stone's office and kill him. Again, this is not impossible, but it definitely is highly improbable, and made even more improbable by the unforeseen complication in his plan that is the arrival of an FBI agent claiming jurisdiction over his case. As he would need to get Kirby situated with her own desk and exchange the intel and resources with her that she had already alluded to, it seems like he would probably have his hands tied for quite some time, and therefore wouldn't get the opportunity to leave the precinct. We can also glean that he was not the first one on the scene of the murder, and possibly never even made it down there at all, as the evidence bag containing Roman Bridger's mask indicates that it was collected by a different police detective altogether. Another thing to take into consideration is that Sam offers Dr. Stone as her alibi from the night before, and even though she tells Wayne that she can give him his name and contact information, this exchange never actually occurs. It could be assumed that Sam wrote it down for him before she decided to leave the interrogation room, but seeing as how Dr. Stone's murder was a premeditated act that was meant to link the killing spree to an anonymous online stalker, as indicated later on by Ethan, it suggests that the Kirsches had always planned on killing the therapist, and therefore already knew what his address was. In that regard, I think it's more likely that Wayne called one of his children and instructed them to kill Dr. Stone, which means that this Ghostface is either Ethan or Quinn. We can assume that Quinn spent all night at home and that Ethan went back to his dorm room with Chad, where we don't see either of them again until they're gathered on the Blackmore campus at 1:21 p.m., according to the time on Mindy's watch, so again, there's really no way to figure out just yet which one of them this is. However, another important detail that should be discussed here is the killer's usage of the cracked Ghostface mask. For reference, almost every time that the killer is on screen, they're wearing the aged mask that originally belonged to Billy Loomis. The only exceptions to this, besides Jason, is the traditional mask that is worn on the subway, which was presumably used so they could blend in with the other Halloween costumes, and then during the climax, where Ethan and Quinn are seen wearing the masks belonging to Nancy and Stu. Obviously, the primary usage of the one mask can be gleaned by recognizing its specific details, but the fact that Wayne was wearing it during the Bodega attack, and now it appears to be in the possession of either of his kids, lets us know that we can't use it as an indicator to specifically pinpoint one killer. However, this does let us know that the three killers are sharing it, which means that at varying points throughout the movie, they would have to pass it off to one another. And I would be remiss to not point out the glaring plot hole it creates, as by Wayne's own admission later on, he plans on posing Sam and Tara's dead bodies with the very same Billy Loomis mask. This to me either makes the Kirsches extremely stupid or just highlights a contradiction in the plot, as by its very own rules that the movie is playing by here, each one of these old Ghostface masks contains traces of DNA belonging to the past killers. This then begs the question that if all three of them are wearing this same mask and getting their DNA all over it, why on earth would they want to leave that behind as crime scene evidence? That's just ludicrous. All feelings aside, I think the mask sharing presents a strong case to indicate that Wayne was Jason and Greg's killer, since he had possession of the mask by the time he carried out the attack on the bodega. Of course, that doesn't negate the possibility that Ethan or Quinn could have used the mask first and then passed it off to him in the 60 to 90 minutes following Jason's murder, but I think the clincher for me here is going to come down to the kill style. We've discussed this in past Who Killed Who videos, especially when it came to Scream 5, and there's a distinct similarity in the way that Wayne stabs the first customer in the bodega to the way that the killer stabs Jason in his apartment, as both acts are done in a rapid-fire succession to the abdomen. With that in mind, I'm confident in my decision to say that Wayne did indeed kill both Jason and Greg, as even though the evidence is circumstantial, more of it does fall on him than it does for either of his children. Now, from this point onward, we won't need to rely so much on meticulous timelines, as our killers are more or less positioned in a way that leaves very little room to misinterpret their known whereabouts. So I think this will be mostly straightforward, even if some of the movie's logic is a bit uneven. And this is especially the case for the apartment attack, as we know by virtue of Quinn being in the same room as one of the other Ghostfaces that there is no possible way that this could be her. As a matter of fact, it has been confirmed that Jack Champion himself is wearing the costume in this shot. However, I will point out that just because an actor does stand in for a stunt performer, it doesn't automatically mean that they're meant to be the person behind the mask, as both Matthew Lillard and Skeet Ulrich took turns wearing the costume where the killer sneaks up behind Randy. However, in terms of this being Ethan, there are some questionable inclusions here that need to be addressed. Firstly, when we see Quinn laying in bed as the killer skulks behind her, she's presumably having a conversation with her father over the phone. This would seem to confirm confirm that Ethan is the Ghostface in the room, meaning that the only people included in this conversation are all three of our killers. However, the dialogue here appears to be the follow-up from an earlier scene in which Kirby suggested that Wayne tell Quinn to be cautious around Sam, which is a conversation that makes sense for them to be having if the purpose of it were to be keeping up with the optics of their fake identities. But seeing as how the rest of the friends are in the common area while Quinn's boyfriend is out of earshot in the bathroom, it means that this is a fake conversation that is not being had for anyone's benefit, as the only people involved here wouldn't realistically need to put on these pretenses for one another. Secondly, Ethan shows up the following morning and appears to have a solid alibi for the night of the attack, as he was in an economics study hall with 100 other students, all of whom he claims can attest to this fact. Chad and Mindy even verify this information, as confirmed through dialogue when they get to the shrine, so there's definitely something in the writing that isn't 100% adding up here. This is where I have a bit of a problem with this movie, as some of the justifications for these killers kind of undermine the viability of the storytelling. Obviously, this is where we have to operate through a lot of tricky mental gymnastics in order to make sense of things, and while I feel I've already done a bit of that leading up to the bodega attack, it's kind of gotten to a point here where things just don't really gel. That's not to say that this is the only Scream movie that has plot holes, as there have definitely been inconsistencies in the past, either due to omitted information or an oversight in logic, but those were circumstances that could be rationalized by sloppy killers or by using our own headcanon to fill in some sort of narrative gap. Conversely, with Scream 6, we're presented with almost too much expositional detail that it gets to the point where a lot of it starts to contradict itself. And while that doesn't necessarily make it more difficult to figure out who killed who, it certainly makes it a lot less inspiring. Now, taking this scene at face value, Quinn talking on the phone with Wayne would 100% confirm to us that Ethan is the Ghostface in the room with her. But since we only get to hear Quinn's side of this exchange, there's no guarantee that she's even on the phone with anyone. That could suggest that she's actually having this conversation with her father in person, if he is the Ghostface in the room, with the scene conveniently cutting back and forth between Danny's perspective during any instance where Wayne would feasibly be speaking in response to her. Personally, I reject this theory because in that case, are we supposed to believe that she's on the phone checking her voicemail while talking to her father with her back turned to him? But the thing that I find so frustrating about this scene is that it's blocked in a way that presents Quinn as being unaware of the killer's presence, which we know is a blatant lie. Obviously, this was an intentional effort done so in order to set up the surprise of her reveal in the climax, as the movie still wanted us to believe that Quinn at this point was a Ghostface victim. But while having a character who acts as an unreliable narrator can be a great method to misdirect suspicion and conceal the truth, if that narration is instead being presented from an omniscient point of view, like it is in this scene, it becomes a case of the movie just outright cheating its audience by presenting an improbable scenario for the sake of justifying a plot twist, without having to do any of the work to actually get there. And since the movie does pull this trick on us again later on, it's clear that the writers and directors aren't playing fair when it comes to positioning the killers in the plot. With that in mind, let's re-examine the dialogue spoken by Quinn in this scene to see if we can find a different context that more closely aligns with the action that's about to play out. If we listen closely, Quinn can be heard saying 3 separate lines of dialogue. First, she says,
"Yeah, I know she's my roommate, but you're like the police."
Then she says,
"No, I know."
And finally,
"She's really freaked out and paranoid."
And mind you, directly after that last line, she's no longer holding onto the cell phone, which could bolster the argument that Wayne is the one in the room with her. If we take a look at the script, however, it gives even more context to not only the conversation, but the writer's intent for how they wanted to frame this entire scene. In addition to the lines we already heard, Quinn also tells her father that she can't make Sam call him, implying that Wayne needed Sam to be persuaded into speaking with him. That would make sense given that the last scene between Sam and Wayne saw her refusing to cooperate with the police, but it doesn't add up with the fact that the killers are about to stage Quinn's death. However, while the script explicitly states that Wayne is on the phone, meaning that this Ghostface was always intended to be Ethan, if we read further down, Quinn actually reacts to hearing a thud coming from the bathroom and calls out to her boyfriend before getting up to investigate the noise, which was actually filmed for the movie. movie and could partially be seen during the official trailer. This part of the scene was most likely cut for how illogical it was, but even as it is in the final cut, it doesn't make any sense. The only thing that I could possibly theorize is that Quinn is on the phone complaining to her dad about having to fake her death, as her referring to him as being like the police might suggest that she was trying to persuade him into considering a more practical method of gaslighting Sam and Tara. Either way, it doesn't make things any more comprehensible when the Ghostface killer in question shows up the next day with a seemingly airtight alibi. Now, in my opinion, this is not as egregious as the previous plot contrivance, since this can be chalked up to the core four just being either really dumb or lazy when it comes to following through on Ethan's alibi. I've also heard some people suggest that Wayne was the one who looked into this, in which case he would have simply just lied to the group anyway, but considering that Wayne himself was pulled from the investigation due to Quinn's murder, and based on the gravitas at which Chad and Mindy initially approached their suspicions, it seems very unlikely that this is something that would be easily glossed over, especially considering the scope of witnesses that Ethan allegedly has at his disposal. However, I question whether there even was an economic study hall to begin with, as it seems very unlikely that there would be an official gathering of students at 7 o'clock on a Sunday night. So again, I think the easiest way to maneuver around this one is to accept the fact that not only did Ethan make up a fake story that wasn't even believable, but that the characters were also too stupid to realize or properly look into things, and the movie just yada over the details, so here we are now. In any event, the way I see this whole thing playing out is that Quinn was at home by herself while the rest of the friends were out shopping for dinner. At some point, Ethan arrived at the apartment and helped Quinn gather up and dispose of all the knives from the kitchen, which they would have had the foresight to do after witnessing Sam immediately go for the knife block the night before. After this, everyone returns to the apartment where Paul 2.0 stops by to hook up with Quinn, meaning that Ethan would have been hiding in the closet watching his sister get it on with her boyfriend, which is just really skanky and proves my earlier point that this family has absolutely no scruples. According to Wayne later on, they managed to pull off Quinn's fake death by using a prosthetic throat wound and switching her body out with a fresh corpse. This would mean that after Ethan went into the bathroom to kill Quinn's boyfriend, he helped apply her prosthetic and then put on a show for Danny, who was watching and recording her fake attack from across the alley. From that point, all Quinn had to do was play dead while Ethan attacked the rest of the friend group, which, by the way, we should be able to match Ethan's stabbing method to later on in the shrine, as similar to the way he stabs Kirby once in the stomach. He does the same thing here with Annika, which in both cases, Sam was able to intervene by using something to bash him in the head with. As Wayne had also mentioned that this plan involved him being the first officer on the scene, I imagine that he was parked close by, and once he was given the go-ahead by his kids, he took the dead body out of his car and lugged it up several flights of stairs, while Quinn and Ethan snuck out the back, leaving their father to get into character and practice his impending crocodile tears. Of course, this brings up a lot of other logical questions, as the daytime scene is clearly taking place more than 12 hours later, but are we meant to believe that Wayne stole a fresh cadaver from the morgue, or do we actually think that he found a living woman who looked like Quinn and then murdered her for the sole purpose of making this little switcheroo? Because in that case, we would need to add an entirely new victim to the kill count. Whatever the scenario is, things at least become a lot more simplified after this, as it should be understood that Ethan passed the Billy Loomis mask off to Quinn, as not only does she later on attest to being responsible for every subsequent Ghostface kill and attack, but by process of elimination, we would have to know that Ethan wasn't responsible for anything else until the climax, as he spends the interim of the movie tagging along with the rest of the friend group. As I had mentioned earlier though, Wayne's presence during the park scene also lets us know that Quinn is the one who places the phone call to Sam, which, based on Kirby's FBI tracing technology, tells us that it's originating from Gale's apartment on the Upper West Side. Since the sting operation in the park was Wayne's idea and didn't appear to serve any purpose besides misdirect the FBI away from the killers, it seems as though the plan was to separate Gale from the rest of the group in order to dispose of her quietly and tow the narrative that the killer is an anonymous Reddit user seeking vigilante justice against the Woodsboro survivors. But in that case, why even have Quinn call Sam to begin with? All Wayne had to do was bide his time by keeping everyone busy in the park. Yet the phone call ends up leading to the trace, which in turn allows Sam and Tara to become aware of the potential danger and ultimately react to it by coming to Gale's rescue. Further to that, Gale finding the shrine technically made her part of the FBI investigation, whether Kirby liked it or not, so it ends up being just a really lucky coincidence for the killers that Kirby would even exclude Gale, as that's an unpredictable variable that's out of their control, which would need to happen in order to facilitate this whole convoluted plan. Believe me, I'm not just trying to rag on this film, as I understand that there is a certain level of disbelief one needs to suspend in order to enjoy this, but this is getting to a point where the killers are just flagrantly setting themselves up for failure, as they're leaving a lot of it up to chance and then self-sabotaging their own efforts, in spite of running into all of this random good luck earlier on. In any event, we know that Quinn is the one who kills Brooks and attacks Gale, so the only thing we really need to figure out here are the phone calls. Again, similar to the earlier phone call scene leading into the bodega, I think that Radio Silence's intention here was to frame the caller and attacker as the same person, as the voice on the phone even tells Gale that they won't be able to stop this, just as soon as Brooks is thrown through the bookshelf. Obviously, this highlights an even greater technical inconsistency than the last time, as not only should we hear the sounds of Brooks choking on his own blood after getting his throat slashed, but there should also be a noticeable change in the inflection of the caller's voice, as anyone, let alone Quinn, would become very winded during the ensuing struggle of the kill, not to mention the subsequent heaving of a huge adult male body across a room. Therefore, I think the most practical way this could have played out would again be a scenario where the attacker was conferenced into the call on mute, while one of the other killers did all of the talking. This would then allow them to verbally signal to Quinn when it was time to make her move, as there's no possible way that one person could have done all of this talking and heavy lifting simultaneously on their own. As far as we know, Ethan was with Chad and Mindy this entire time, since we last saw them together at the park before they arrived at Gale's apartment after the attack, and since Wayne is next seen back at the precinct later on, we know that he would have separated from the group after leaving the park, which would give him plenty of time and privacy in order to be a part of Gale's phone call. In that regard, from a logical standpoint, I'm going to credit the first phone call to Wayne, but as far as the second phone call is concerned, I don't think that there's any possibility this could be anyone other than the Ghostface in the apartment, as Gale quite literally calls back their number and hears the sound of the ringing cell phone on the other side of her door. That would mean that Quinn for sure called Gale the second time, which not only can be inferred by the 707 area code that would show up as Richie's Modesto, California phone number, but also in the fact that the caller is directly referencing Gale having shot at them with her gun moments earlier. As far as Quinn killing Brooks, I'll forego any major criticism regarding her ability to lift and hurl a 200+ pound man, since all of these movies have operated under the conceit that anyone who wears the Ghostface costume must suddenly develop supernatural strength. But with all things considered, I will agree with anyone who thinks that this is just one kill in the franchise that needs to be taken with a giant grain of salt. Moving on, however, this then leads us into the subway scene, which, as far as I'm concerned, I think that we can take Quinn's confession to stabbing Mindy as the absolute truth, as Ethan was obviously on the train out of costume at the same time, and Wayne would have been at the precinct still, as he was shown to be there both before and after the events of the subway sequence took place. The only thing that doesn't make sense here is Ethan's bizarre behavior, as his rescuing of Mindy does not align with his family's scheme, especially since it creates even more work for them to do later on. This is expressed to Sam and Tara, as Wayne reveals that he later plans on going to the hospital to kill both Mindy and Gale, but again, this feels like a case of the killers either self-sabotaging their own efforts or the writers creating an improbable scenario just for the sake of cheating the audience into an unearned surprise unmasking. Realistically, Ethan should not have gone over to help Mindy, as the more practical approach would have been him pretending not to see her and instead exit the train with a crowd of people while letting her bleed out on her own. He could have even gone over to her with a knife and finished the job that Quinn started, albeit he might run the risk of getting caught, but it would have at least been one less target for the killers to have to worry about later on. The only benefit for Ethan to rescue Mindy really would be to alleviate any suspicion of him she may have had, but seeing as how she never makes it to the shrine with him to meet the other characters and we don't see Ethan again until he's revealed, it doesn't actually end up serving any practical relevance. Therefore, even if Mindy had survived survived her stabbing without Ethan's interference, she still would have incorrectly assumed he wasn't the killer, since both scenarios present him as being a bystander. Regardless of all that, she somehow figures out that Ethan and Wayne are the killers anyway, despite the fact that we never see what it is that allows her to make that connection. And as she's last seen before the climax, admitting to herself that she was wrong about Ethan, it highlights another lapse in continuity, where we as an audience are forced to fill in the gaps on our own. Therefore, my personal headcanon is that after Quinn failed to make the kill, Ethan panicked and thought that Mindy would incriminate him in the attack if it was anyone other than he who came to her aid. It was obviously a huge miscalculation on his part, but since we know he ends up at the shrine soon after this, it has to be understood that at some point in the interim, he fled the scene and left Mindy behind. This would obviously be a huge red flag that would make her suspect him again, and since Mindy was being tended to by the police at that point, perhaps she said something to them about Wayne, and that inadvertently exposed him to the rest of the force, as by that point, a lot of the Kirsch family's flimsy scheme was already crumbling all around them. Either way, that takes us into the question of which Ghostface was whom by the time they showed up at the shrine. This one is relatively easy, as by this point, Quinn and Ethan have adorned the Stu and Nancy masks, respectively, so we'll be able to use that as a marker to indicate which killer was which before their reveals. Looking at them separately, the Stu mask appears to have a long slice that runs through the left side of the face, while the Nancy mask has veiny-like cracking above and beside the left eye. As far as time continuity goes, Quinn appears to leave the subway before Ethan, which means that she got a head start towards the theater, and if we can trust that Kirby did her job properly when she said that she cleared the building beforehand, this means that the killers would have entered the shrine by sneaking in through the upstairs emergency exit. We know by this killer wearing the Stu mask that Quinn is the one who stabs Tara while she's kissing Chad, which is ironic for her to be cock-blocking them yet again, but as I don't think Ethan had arrived at the shrine just yet, this would also suggest that Quinn was the one who attacked and knocked out Kirby off screen. As the Ghostface who jumps out at Sam, Tara, and Chad from the stage is wearing the Stu mask, that means that this is still Quinn, who would have taken the shortcut down the narrow hallway in order to cut them off from behind the screen. As Quinn chases them back into the concession area, that means that she's the one who was almost taken out by Chad, before Ethan then stabs him from behind, as we can see that this second Ghostface killer is instead wearing the Nancy mask. Judging by where in the lobby Ethan appears from, it seems as though he would have entered the room by coming down the staircase, which I believe is an indication that he had just arrived at the theater by coming in through the same door that's located on the mezzanine. With both killers now on screen together, we can also discern which Ghostface is who when they stab Chad, and then finally we can also tell that Quinn is the one who chases Sam and Tara back into the shrine, while it's now Ethan who uses the narrow hallway in order to cut them off from the stage. After this, the two of them are unmasked, so we can pretty much trace their steps right up to that moment, but that should all more or less cover every instance that Ghostface is physically seen on screen. So before I circle back to the Dr. Stone kill, I do want to acknowledge that Wayne once again has the Billy mask in his possession, so it can be presumed that at some point after the attack in Gale's apartment, Quinn would have met up with her father in order to pass it off to him. However, in spite of my verbose and ridiculously analytical way of looking at things here, I think there's actually an even simpler way of breaking down this entire thing. The events of the movie primarily take place over 3 days: Saturday the 29th, Sunday the 30th, and Monday the 31st. If we go by the timeline here, including when we knew who for sure had possession of the Billy mask, that tells us that the killers divided their duties by having a different family member act as Ghostface for their own allotted day. Wayne would have been the first one on Saturday, where he killed Greg, Jason, and the 3 bystanders at the bodega. Ethan would have taken over on Sunday, killing Paul 2.0 and Annika, and then Quinn took her turn on Monday, where she kills Brooks but failed to kill Gale and Mindy before all 3 of them then coalesced at the shrine. So as Dr. Stone was also killed on Sunday, and I really don't have anything else to go by in order to differentiate whether this was Ethan or Quinn, I'm going to headcanon this idea of a killer schedule as part of their scheme, and since Ethan committed the murders on Sunday night, I think it's safe to assume that he was on call for that entire day. This killer schedule theory also somewhat makes sense with what their plan was on framing a non-existent Reddit user, since as far as any witnesses would be concerned, they would only ever see the killer wearing the one specific mask, with the exception of the subway attack. So even though they're going to leave said mask behind at the scene of Sam and Tara's murder, with each one of them having their DNA DNA all over it. I guess in their warped minds, they actually believed that this was something they would get away with. Anyway, there are 13 kills altogether, assuming that Quinn's body double was not a Ghostface victim, but rather taken from the morgue, which gives us Greg Bruckner, 0 kills, Jason Carvey, 1 kill, Quinn Bailey, also 1 kill, Ethan Landry, 3 kills, Wayne Bailey, 5 kills, and then just for completion's sake, Sam Carpenter, 2 kills with Wayne and Quinn Bailey, and Kirby Reed, 1 kill with Ethan Landry. I want to thank a few of my Patreon supporters like Gary Blasek, PJ Hunt, Garrison Nichols, Peyton Rott, and Jay Galatello. If you want to see even more Scream-related content, including Who Killed Who and the rest of the Scream movies, you can check out either one of these playlists right over here. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.